When I was, I think, a teenager, maybe very early in college, I was at a meeting where a young pastor was speaking, and he made this statement that I've never forgotten in all of these years. He said, "The joy of the ministry is in knowing where to start." But he never did get around to saying where to start, and I didn't get a chance to ask him later, and I wondered for years and years and years, what did he mean? The joy of the ministry is in knowing where to start. Let me switch gears real quickly here. I want to tell you the story of someone I heard of. A man who had a family and had to flee to protect them. It was a small family. Fortunately for him, they only had one child because more children makes it more difficult to flee. He lived in a part of the world that was politically unstable. I could tell you it was the Middle East, and you would already know it was politically unstable because it's been that way for as long as I can remember. He lived in a country that had a totalitarian government. He was ruled over by a dictator who was ruthless. A dictator who was very well known for using his military against his own people whenever he thought there might be some challenge to his rule breaking out. So this was where this man lived, and it was a difficult existence from day to day, as you can imagine. I think as this story unfolds, I had to fill in a lot of the gaps, but I can imagine this man as he comes home at the end of the day and does, I think at the end of the day, what every father does. You know what Dad does when everything is done and the dishes are put away and everybody's in bed. You know what Dad does. He goes through and makes sure all the lights are turned off, right? And that's probably what he did. And he checked the doors to make sure they were locked. And he looked in at his pretty young wife and their child had fallen asleep together in each other's arms, and he smiled at the fact that they were sleeping peacefully, and he laid down too. And he listened to the breeze outside the window, and his heart was filled with love for them. Just listen to the quiet. And then he woke suddenly because a warning had come. A warning had come. "Yusuf, get up. Go. They're coming for the children." And a quick glance out the window showed lights on the hill as a troop of soldiers began to move down into the valley where they lived. So he woke his wife quickly, silently, as quietly as he could, told her to get up, and as quickly as they could, they packed up some clothing, and they packed up a little bit of food, and they grabbed whatever cash they could find in the house, and out the back door they went, through the alleys, and up into the hills themselves, where they could see what happened. And as they watched, this group of soldiers came down into that town and began going from house to house to house, breaking down the doors, going into the houses, dragging out the children, the youngest ones, and killing them in the streets of that town. And when this man that I heard about saw this, he knew that there was no way he could go back to that town where he had grown up. No way he could go back there and live. So they just set out. I don't know that they knew where they were going at first, but they set out for the nearest border, because they realized that as long as that person was at the top of their government, they were never going to be safe. And they walked hundreds of miles, mostly through desert, but also through mountainous highlands. And they walked as far as they could. They walked until they were into another country, which they entered, of course, illegally. They had no other way to get in there. And this young family, I don't know, that's as far as much of the story as I really know. I don't know how they got there. Can you imagine having to do that yourself? Can you imagine if you had to get up in the middle of the night with your family and walk from here to Canada? And they may have gone further than that. I'm not sure of the distance that they went. Just to walk like that and only living what you have. I think there must have been people along the way perhaps that helped them. Maybe they had squirreled away enough cash that they were able to pay bribes to get across the border. I don't know what they did when they ran into police or soldiers, but somehow they got into this other country, and they lived there for a while. They lived there until they felt it was finally safe to go back again. This is the story, of course, that we read this morning. Jesus of Nazareth spent some of his earliest years as a refugee, as an immigrant, as someone living in a land that was not his own. It's not a remarkable story. It is a story that we have heard over and over and over again over the last 2,000 years. It's certainly a common story today. A family that has to flee in the night and walk as far as they can walk and cross a border into another country where they hope they will be welcomed and helped. Jesus was a refugee. And if you think about it, the Bible is full of the stories of refugees. Abraham, the very first person that we hear about that we believe is a historical fact, Abraham himself was a refugee. He packed up and left his home and walked into a far land. His grandson Jacob was forced to flee famine and move back to Egypt again to live there as a refugee, and his descendants eventually became slaves there. Moses helped his people get free from slavery, but they were refugees in the desert for 40 years, living like nomads out there because there was no home for them yet. The people of Jerusalem were taken into captivity in Babylon, and that's what we read about today, the song and the scripture passage, taken and made to live thousands of miles away from their home. Many died along the way on this forced march. Both Saints Peter and St. Paul were executed in Rome, far, far away from their homes. And everyone in this room today is the descendant of a refugee. Every one of us is the descendant of a refugee. And I don't mean just because some of you came here to get out of Ireland like my family did, or wherever else they may have come from. Here's the fact. How old is this church? What year did High Street Church begin? 1826. We were, and was that you, Lynn? Yes, okay. Of all the people in this church, I knew Lynn would know that, right? So High Street Church was established in 1826 as a Congregational church at the time. And Congregational churches began in what year in the United States? 1620. What happened in 1620? The Pilgrims landed. We are the direct spiritual descendants of the Pilgrims. Did you know this about us? That is who we are. We are the direct spiritual descendants of the Pilgrims, who were refugees. Everyone in this room is the descendant of a refugee. And the joy of ministry is knowing what? Where to start. The joy of ministry is knowing where to start, and I think I finally know what it means. It means we start at the bottom. We live in a world that arranges people on different levels, and the people with the power on the top and the people without power at the bottom. And I don't know whether it is that having power puts you on the top or being on the top gives you power. It's probably a combination of both. But that's the world we live in. It arranges things that way, and it puts some people higher up than others. Those at the top have the power. And it's no different now than it was in Jesus' time. It was the same way for him. And where did Jesus begin when he started his ministry? Where did he start? He didn't go to the palace in Jerusalem. He didn't go to the castles in Rome. Where did he start? With the peasants on the ground, sitting outside in circles, maybe, if they were lucky, in a house with a courtyard big enough to hold them all. He began among the working poor. He began among the sick and disabled. He began among those people who had been discarded as useless. That's the ones that he started with. Jesus' starting place was at the bottom. And when we read his story, we see that there were times when people who had power wanted to get Jesus on their side, and he refused it. He wouldn't go there. He continued to start his ministry working with the people who were the lowest down. Now, today in the United States, we are having a big debate about immigration. It's not the first time. Has there been an immigration problem in the Lewiston area, the Lewiston-Auburn area, ever before now? Okay, anybody here with a French last name? Okay, so It's not a new thing, but we have a serious debate going on about immigration right now, and a lot of heated language. Most recently, this thing called DACA is in the news. Have you heard about this? Now, DACA is a program called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA. And the idea is that children who were brought here illegally but have lived here all of their lives have been given permission to remain without being deported as illegals. And that program, well, we don't know where it's at now. Has it been canceled? Has it not been canceled? Things are very confused about this. What I know for sure is that there are people in this country who are immigrants, some legal, some not legal, who are very unsure about what their status is. They are anxious currently about their future. Immigration has always been a problem in the United States because we are torn between the desire to welcome people who need to come and the desire to say, hey, enough already, we've got our own problems here, and we get caught up in our prejudices and our fears, and we don't know what we're going to do about it. And I do not know the answer to the immigration problem, and the Bible doesn't give it either. But I do know something. I know one thing. I know where the joy of ministry is. Where is it? Knowing where to start. And I want to start at the bottom where the powerless are. In matters of immigration, who are the powerless? When the people without power cry out, the followers of Jesus listen and respond. And it's not easy, and it's never going to be easy to try to help those who are without power. So many things can go wrong. And I don't know what to do about it, but as a follower of the way of Jesus, I know where to start. I start by listening to the immigrants and the refugees and the alien, because one that I loved, Jesus, was once one of them. Here's another thing that's happening in society, and I know these things may not seem like they are connected, but I believe they are. They're certainly connected in time. There's a big debate going on in our country now about transgendered people. And two things have happened on this recently. One is what are so-called bathroom bills, where these have been proposed in many places, and also here in Maine was proposed but was defeated. The idea being that people have to use the bathroom that corresponds to the gender that was written on their birth certificate when they were born. It was proposed here, like I said, but not passed. It's been passed in other places, and it's pointed at transgendered people. And by transgendered people, we mean people whose internal gender identity, the way they think of themselves, does not match what seems to be their physical gender identity. And it's not like this is something new, because transgendered people have lived among us for a long time, for always. Until recently, however, they were not allowed to seek treatment or equality in society. Transgendered people have been coming out of the closet lately, and that's created problems because we built a society that ignored the needs of transgendered people, and now that they are saying they want to be recognized, it creates problems, and we don't know what we're going to do. And this past couple of weeks, there was a law passed, a rule passed, an executive order, that transgendered people would not be allowed to serve in the military any longer, even though there are many who are already there. I don't know the solution to this problem. I'll tell you this much, I do know. When transgendered people are told they are not welcome, it is one more slap in the face to people who have been slapped in the face over and over and over and over. And I'm speaking about my niece today, who doesn't need to hear on the news that she is no longer welcome because of who she is. And I am glad that this is not a church that will do that. I don't know the solution to the problems. I recognize that there are problems in trying to figure out exactly how to enable transgendered people to fit into our society. We're going to have to make some changes, and we don't know exactly how to do it. And I don't know what to do, but I do know one thing. I know where to start. I figured that much out. I know where to start. And I start by listening to the cry of the powerless. It's easy. In this case, it's transgendered persons, so outnumbered in society, it is easy for society to push them aside. Now, let me ask you, is this sermon too political? I don't know, might be. I was telling somebody earlier today that Sometimes I walk right up to the line, and if I cross it, people will say, hey, you crossed that line. And if I don't cross it, people will say, why didn't you cross that line? So I don't know. I know that the joy of ministry is in knowing where to start, and I know the starting place is to listen to the people who have something to say. When people march in the streets, I start by listening to what they have to say. I might not agree with what they have to say, but I start at that point. I start listening to it. When there is a strike outside a business, I start by listening to the workers, because that's the beginning place where the power is not. When tax policy is set, and that's the next big thing we're going to attempt in this country, when tax policy is set, I ask my legislators to start by considering the needs of the person at the bottom, not at the people at the top, and figure out how we're going to do things that way. And it's not always easy to figure out. Is there anybody here who has not been confused as you tried to figure out what to do in this world? Well, maybe this is too much, but let me say this in closing. Think about this. If the message of Christ is, we're going to start with the people at the bottom, it's bad news for you if you are one of the people at the top. But I think there's a lot of people in this room who, for one reason or another, are at the bottom. And if that's where God's care and grace begins, then this is good news for you. And if you are one of the people at the top, it's also good news for you, because it gives you the opportunity to do something that Jesus would do. The joy of the ministry is in knowing where to start. And where do we start? We start at the bottom. Amen.
You've been listening to a sermon by Reverend Stephen Carnahan, pastor of High Street Congregational Church in Auburn, Maine. If you feel inspired by what you hear, we invite you to join us in person for worship services every Sunday morning, beginning at 10 o'clock. Of course, you can always listen to Steve's sermons on the web. New sermons are posted every Monday by midday. Please take a moment to explore this website for more information about our church, or visit our Facebook page at High Street Congregational Church, UCC. We hope that God's presence will be known to you every hour of every day, and that God's blessings will rest upon you now and always. See you next week.